Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to slightly abbreviate the introductory remarks, and I urge everyone to take a look at the really interesting activities of all of our speakers. But our second speaker will be Katherine Don, who's the head of Arts and Cultural Development at the Asia Society Hong Kong Center, where she oversees the gallery and exhibition program. Prior to joining the Asia Society Hong Kong, she worked as head of contemporary art at Sotheby's Hong Kong and brings over 15 years experience with contemporary art in Asia, working to promote cross-cultural exchange between artists and patrons. Born in Hawaii, Katherine holds a dual degree in art history and East Asian studies from Barnard College at Columbia and received an MBA from the UCLA's Anderson School of Management as well. Her talk will be titled Field Notes from Hong Kong, Curating Contemporary Ink Art. Please welcome Katherine.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Professor Shen for organizing this opportunity, inviting me to be here today, and thank you to Nanhai and the Asian Art Museum for organizing this amazing art week, which I think is just so wonderful for the community here in the U.S. It's a real opportunity for me to be in the company of these esteemed colleagues because they have significantly more experience than I do in the field and probably more academic reasons to be here. And so, following a little bit what Abby said, I think part of what my talk is to share with you just my observations in the field. I'm not here to talk about trends or very specific academic historical analysis, but my path in ink art is more of an independent journey, and my talk is titled Field Notes from Hong Kong because I have a little bit of a unique background, having started in the gallery world in New York, and then living in Beijing for nearly 10 years, working directly with artists and studios, and then working at the auction house with Sotheby's in Hong Kong. My apologies, I don't know whether that's the competitor, but we're all friends here for a common interest in ink art. And now I'm fortunate to have this role at Asia Society in Hong Kong, right? As Julia mentioned, I oversee the gallery program there. And looking back on this path, for me, I've actually always had a focus on ink art and a gravitation towards paper. And so I think it might just be, I'll share with you sort of the activities that I've done over the past decade that kind of visualizes that. And specifically, I'll spend a bit of time talking about what it means to curate an auction, which kind of seems a little bit contradictory to some, but it actually, to me, is a very meaningful experience, and I think that in today's world, we can't ignore the role that the commercial platforms and the auction houses have, especially for raising awareness about ink. I wanted to start just because coincidentally when I heard that Nanhai had organized the exhibitions for Xu Lei and Xu Hualing, I realized that sort of my journey had also dovetailed with them as well. In fact, Xu Hualing and her husband Shen Liang were one of the first artists I ever met. Working in New York, I helped to organize Xu Hualing's exhibition, her first solo exhibition in New York. And this was a really interesting time to be working for a gallery that I think had quite a progressive view on what contemporary Chinese art was, because at the time in the early 2000s, the market was going crazy for a lot of political pop and a lot of imagery that was very, just very different from the exhibition that you'll probably see downstairs. This was also pre-smartphone era, so I didn't have any digital images of her show in 2004, but I did realize I had images from working with Xu Lei in 2010, also bringing his first solo exhibition to New York, to a space with Joan Mervis. And Xu Lei's on the left, my dear friend and colleague, Missine Long, this is her daughter on the right. This is a very hands-on show. At the time, no one was talking about ink art. A lot of the market was actually focusing on Chinese painting that featured post-cultural revolution iconography, things with political messaging, certainly not anything related to more traditional evolution of the Chinese painting tradition. And these are just some installation views of the show. Fantastic surrealist works by Choulet, all on paper, which is actually quite different a little bit from the show that Professor Shen has curated downstairs, which shows more of his Choulet's recent pieces. And in fact, he's going to talk about that later. So I'll just mention that this show is in 2010, and while it was really fun to put together and extremely meaningful, and I think that quite innovative for just contemporary art in general, people who had never seen an artist classically trained in the Chinese painting tradition, painting with such surrealist themes that sort of also dovetail with Western art history. Choulet, to this day, still holds quite a unique position in contemporary art in general. And in 2010, it was impossible to sell this show. So I will tell you that actually this was a commercial bust for us. And it's striking because just a couple years later, the market somehow flipped on a dime and his market exploded. And to this day now, Choulet's, just 2 years later, all of these works that we see, sold for crazy prices. And it's really inaccessible for us. But, these stories happen all the time. And that's what's really exciting about being in this field, is I think that that's the market changing is just a sign that these artists have relevance and have a real audience. These are, I think I just wanted to mention here about the fact that ink art, it's actually quite a difficult term. I think it's also quite new, too. New in the sense that in the last 20 or 30 years, artists working with ink weren't called ink artists, they were just called contemporary artists. They weren't classified by their medium, but in the last 20 or 30 years, there have been a number of exhibitions around the world sort of using this terminology, both abroad and in China. And this is just part of earlier research that I've been doing to share with people that when we actually started a contemporary ink art department at Sotheby's in Hong Kong, that this wasn't a new fad or phenomenon, that this actually had been recognized by major institutions worldwide for decades. I think it was just the market was slow to pick up on this trend. So in 2013, Sotheby's, led by Mixin Long, who I mentioned earlier, started their first contemporary ink art auction and selling exhibition. Selling exhibition is the auction house's way of saying that they're competing directly in the primary market with galleries. And you had tons of press coming out. This is the Wall Street Journal article talking about, is Chinese contemporary ink painting the next big thing? I will also mention that what Abby said earlier is that it's actually interesting in talking about ink art, it was always related to China. But one thing that I would probably argue is that I don't see ink art that way. I think that it's a much more globalized genre, and it should not be just related to Chinese tradition. But anyway, 2013 was very exciting. As I mentioned, Choulet started to get recognized in the market. Sotheby's started these auctions. The moment that Sotheby's had a selling exhibition in New York, it sold out. Christie's scrambled, I think, to get its show up. It also sold out, was doing very well in New York, and by the end of that year, Sotheby's, I joined Sotheby's to start the ink art department. And I was talking to Abby yesterday about, actually I was trying to ask her what I should talk about, and I realized that I think the idea of curating within an auction house is actually kind of an unusual concept. And also the development of a new department at an auction house is a very radical, very progressive idea. So, the question is starting a new department wasn't because Sotheby's had discovered this new art form. In fact, what we might consider contemporary ink art had always been selling at auction. It just hadn't been selling under this name, and it had always been in different categories. And this classification issue, I think, is what's most interesting about the ink discourse, is that is ink art anything that exists on paper? Is it because an artist suddenly uses ink and hits some sort of surface with it that it becomes ink art? Or is it because they're following a sort of philosophical tradition, or that they're classically trained and sort of evolving with their current context? All of these things were the questions that I wrestled with every day, trying to promote and articulate what the department meant, both internally at Sotheby's and externally for our audience. And what you're looking at here is an installation view for the first auction in Hong Kong, titled Contemporary Literati. And the initial answer to how to define contemporary ink art was just to say, put it all together. Put it together with old works of art that draw upon classical tradition, put actual ink paintings together, and let people understand that this isn't just a new flash in the pan genre, that to sort of create this historical connection and aesthetic connection with other works of art that are highly regarded. So Contemporary Literati was a joint effort with the Chinese Works of Art Department, where we, under the leadership of Nicholas Chow, who has just a great eye for curating shows. This was a very interesting thematic sale. And thematic sales are a thing in the auction house that I think are, or in my experience, having joined the auction house, is the way that the market is going. To try to get people's attention, to get the market's attention, to compete with our competitors, we had to think very creatively how to represent artwork. And so this turned out to be quite a successful, I think, model for us in Hong Kong, where we showcased furniture with scholars' rocks and contemporary ink art. And people really took notice, and it was really exciting because we were able to get the attention of very seasoned buyers at auction, but also bring in new collectors and new buyers. And I think that's a measure of success, both for an auction house, but also for this genre and this medium. And this is how we started at Sotheby's, defining what contemporary ink art was. What was also really exciting for me is that in addition to being mindful of our commercial purpose, it was really exciting to be able to represent artists that hadn't very strong market records. So great art historical importance, like this artist Tsung Yu Ho, also known as Betty Eke, a Chinese classically trained painter who married the art historian Gustav Eke and moved to Hawaii and cultivated a very interesting, unique hybrid artistic style using collage, but also always rooted in the Chinese classical tradition. And at auction, it was, you might find her works once a year somewhere in some auction, but it was never really focused. And for us to create this department, we really got to recognize very historically important artists and also bring them to a market to also realize their importance at a market level. So this is like a nice perfect storm for an auction house, which is to bring emerging market artists with historical relevance. Therefore, they had great market upside. And that was sort of the strategy for us, was to recognize historically important artists and tell their story, and also be confident that a market could ensue. This is also just an installation view from our contemporary literati sale. That's a major work by the artist Liu Dan. For me, what was also really exciting is that just these phenomenal ink work started coming out of the woodwork. And because we were the only auction house, also I should mention Christie's then also had a department for contemporary ink art as well, but outside of Hong Kong there were no sales like this in the world. And so this really got a lot of attention worldwide. And as a fun side note, we weren't just creating a market for contemporary ink art, we also started to create a market for natural history objects. And what you see on the left is this is a gogat. And a gogat is several million years old rock formations that have this beautiful sculptural aesthetic quality. And yeah, so while I was focused on ink art, I also got to focus on fossils and really interesting things. And you know, I think that just sometimes people may not think about auctions as a place for discovering new art, but I think that what we were trying to do in these thematic sales was precisely that, and I think that was really exciting. I wanted to share this image because this was a Japanese artist that we kind of discovered and brought to market. The artist Inoue Yuichi is a pioneer of the Bokujinkai group in Japan, and speaking about historically relevant artists without a global market, he was a perfect example of someone that was formative in the transition of Japanese modern art towards Gutai. And if you may not be familiar with Gutai, Gutai is now both commercially and most internationally recognized as the most popular art form in Japan. And what preceded that, to me, is a very interesting link to ink art, is that Gutai wouldn't have happened without this experimental expressionist group of artists called Bokujinkai, which translates as ink people or ink society. And Yuichi and his mentor, Shiru Morita, I think I have an image later, Morita, were formative in sort of creating this transition point. They basically said, art needs to be global, international. It can't be just locked in Japan. And in order to do that, we have to move away from traditional forms and traditional ways of thinking. But we shouldn't lose sight of what our roots are. So what they developed is a very groundbreaking philosophy using calligraphy and action painting. So people might think that they were imitating Jackson Pollock or abstract expressionists. That's not true. In fact, I would argue the opposite, that some of the New York artists were actually looking at Japanese painters at that time, thinking about their ideas about expressionism and what they were doing in ink. And this is a bit of a tangent, but what was interesting about the Bokujinkai group is that in the 1950s, MoMA did a big show about these artists, and I think that it catalyzed a very strong dialogue in New York about these ideas that come from ink painting, from Taoist thinking about painting, heavily influenced some of the New York artists at that time. So I like to think that while Gutai, this is Jiro Yoshihara and Shiraga, the painter paints with his feet, radicalized Japanese art, now sell for millions of dollars a piece. Their foundation comes from ink painting and ink art and this moment in Japanese history. So what we were able to do in these sales is we recognize this part of history, and now Yuichi's, I think the price is there, it was about $50,000 US. He now sells for twice as much due to great demand internationally by collectors. This is an example of Morita, and what they were doing is that they were still using calligraphy or characters, but just sort of abstracting them in a very gestural way. And this is a fun juxtaposition I like to share. Many people are familiar with the works by Xu Bing, the landscape calligraphy. This is his Landscript series. He's kind of started this in the 1980s, but when I was doing a lot of research on the Bokujinkai group, I found a lot of Landscript paintings like this by their society. So I know that there's a lot of, artists influence each other all the time. And this is just another testament to, I think, the early innovation that Yuichi brought to the conversation. I just wanted to show a few images of the selling exhibitions that we did at Sotheby's, because while we couldn't bring everyone to auction, because it's a very sensitive thing to do when you bring new artist works to the market, you want to make sure that they sell. Because if they don't sell, you kind of create a signal in the market that it may not be valuable, which is two totally uncorrelated, unrelated things, but people naturally make that association. So Sotheby's did a lot of selling exhibitions, and again, we're able to really raise the profile for some major ink artists and contributors to the field, like Lucius Wong, who's a real pioneer in the Hong Kong ink art scene, Chong Bin, who we've heard about. It was also really important to me that when we had these exhibitions, we thought about ink art in different dimensions. So to bring the Chimeric landscape to Hong Kong was really important. And I think that did start to change people's minds about how ink is not just a two-dimensional form. Just because some of these friends are in the audience, I threw in a picture of a show that we did in New York called The Literati Within. And this was an exhibition that was really fun to put together because we, in thinking about this question about are ink artists, are they defined by their cultural background or their ethnic heritage? The answer is no. The answer is more just, a lot of artists have this attraction to or penchant for the ink medium or this tradition, and it will manifest itself in many different ways. So this was a fun group show where we had works by Arnold Chang and Michael Cherney, Hung Wei, Lois Connor, who does photography, and all express this sort of scholarly sentiment, which coincidentally happened to be related to ink art. And one of my favorite pieces in the show was a work by Mark Quinn. Some of you might know his work as the radical British artist who does a lot of conceptual installation work, but he has started to explore a lot of the scholarly Chinese tradition, and he's a bonsai tree collector. And so some of his more conceptual works have included casts. This is a metal cast of his bonsai trees. I think this ink art tradition has many different ways of inspiring artists today. I just want to quickly run through a proposal an actual proposal that I had made in my last year being at Sotheby's, where we really tried to push this idea that ink is not bound by geography. And these are some of the artists that we suggested. This is Chen Chi Kwan, a major ink painter inspired by printmaking. Siren Sherpa, who some might know, he's based here in Oakland. He's a computer science major, then trained in with his father in Nepal for mural making. Hassan Masadi, an Iraqi calligraffiti artist. We were presenting a lot of these artists because arguing the fact that in their respective contexts, they're all very well respected artists, say in Persian art or in Korean art. There's a founder of the Tansekwa movement, and yet there's this link between all of them, that they have this affinity towards ink and line and the tradition. A young Nihonga painter, a pioneer of ink painting in Hong Kong. A hybrid artist, a very interesting Iranian collage artist using calligraphy. It's really fun to think this way, and I like to think that it's amazing that the auction house afforded us this opportunity to think very broadly and creatively and bring fresh ideas to the market. Aisha Khalid, interesting miniature painter from India but based in London. Anyway, there's so many different ways to approach ink, and what we this is a fun stat. This is just to prove that this is a real market, that this wasn't a bubble, and that we had buyers from all different categories from all over the world, and that it wasn't just quote flash in the pan. So the actual sale was called Confluence, and we were able to bring Hans Hartung, Zendarodi, Christian Kana, and Samu Noguchi to sale in Hong Kong for the first time with great acclaim. And I wanted to share this image because people looking at it without seeing the artist name might think it's a work by Zhao Qi. This is very common to see at auctions in Hong Kong. Yet this is a really fascinating Sumier ink painting by the progressive revolution artist Christian Khanna. So this movement in India was very formative for what modern and contemporary art is now today. But a lot of his influences came from Japan. He received a Rockefeller grant to go to Japan in 1962, and based on that, he basically abandoned socialist figurative painting in favor of colorless line ink inspired works. And I just think this is a really fascinating example of cross-cultural influence. This is a very dark image of the installation view, but on the right you have this beautiful work by Hans Hartung, who is a pioneer of abstract expressionism in France, but completely underrated. And in the center you have a really interesting figurative work by Noguchi, where he went to Beijing to study with Xu Beihong, and another work by Luigi. So these are just some of the install views. And these are what our sales look like. They were very, they crossed times, recent works in the last 5 years to works from the 50s and 60s. And unfortunately, when I left, the sales also stopped in Hong Kong. And that was more of a business decision by Sotheby's, but I was just there at the previews, and unfortunately none of these works are actually on view or on sale. So I hope that will change. Actually, I know it will change because I think there's so many great activities happening outside of the auction place that will continue the importance and relevance of some of these ink artists. Because I currently work at Asia Society, I should probably represent what we've been doing at Asia Society. This is the show that Shen Kui and Julie actually curated for us, and they initiated the series called the 20th Century Chinese Female Artists Painting Series. What's interesting about this series and the artists that it recognizes that the idea was to recognize these important artists, and then it became apparent that these artists happened to be women and that these artists happened to be grounded in ink. So the series started with Fang Jiaolin, a major artist known in Hong Kong for a very unusual initially Lingnan-inspired artwork turned much more fantastical, kind of naive painting-esque style. And to this day, there's no painter like her. She's, fantastic. And similarly, the second second show in the series is about Pan Yulin. Pan Yulin, also a Chinese artist, but actually spent her life in Paris. And in the early 1920s, she was sort of the ambassador who introduced all the Chinese artists who later went to study in Paris, like Zhao Qi. And what's just amazing about her is that she's a fiercely independent woman. She was actually a concubine turned painter. She had this amazing benefactor that bought her, per se, and allowed her to go to Paris, and she lived her entire life in Paris as an artist. And what's interesting about Pan Yulin is that she was a female painter painting female subjects. And you rarely see this in any art discourse about the female figure being addressed by a woman. And actually right now, just opened a few weeks ago, is, sorry, is that a signal to me?
No. Once you go
out. Sorry. This is Irene Zhou, and like I said before, these artists are just important in their own right. It's a coincidence that they're women. Again, there's no painter like Irene Zhou. Her style is just so unusual, and her approach is so innovative. She started in the 60s, started in the 60s in Hong Kong. Again, Lingnan trained with Zhao Xiaoang. What you see on the left is a mantis fan by Zhao Xiaoang, and on the right you see, I think, Zhou's really unusual stocking painting. She took a watercolor and stuck it inside a woman's stocking and collaged it onto paper and added this small Lingnan detail. It's dated probably from the early 1980s. In the context of Hong Kong art, you just never, or even ink art, you just never see anything like this. This is quite innovative. These are just, the show is sort of like a retrospective. It does cover over 5 decades of her career. Got it. And if you're in Hong Kong, it's on until December. So just for fun, because I just went to this right before I got on the plane to come here. Ink Asia has started, and while the auction houses may not be, while Sotheby's is not doing sales, but Christie's continues to do ink art sales. There was ink fairs, and this started 4 years ago. Ink Asia started in Hong Kong, and it's really fantastic. They bring together galleries from all over the world who kind of represent this idea that I've been talking about, and that maybe Abby has hinted at, is that ink is global. It's not just relegated to China or Greater China. These are paintings by the artist Zheng Xiaojun, who is a collector connoisseur, and he basically paints objects in his collection. So, yeah, I'll go into that. There's works by Feng Jialin that are on view. The sculpture in the front also can be considered ink art. This is by Zhang Yu, who is a very highly conceptual artist who kind of wants to deconstruct and essentialize ink painting to its core. So he doesn't even use a brush anymore. He uses his finger, and those are fingerprints made on the surface of a sculptural object. Since the Ink Asia is in Hong Kong, you have a lot of Hong Kong representation. So on the right, you have the artist Kong Wei Bong, who's curated students of his from Baptist University. You can kind of see a little bit of what that looks like. You have these interested curated sales. I like to think that the contemporary literati sales were inspired by or have inspired other dealers to juxtapose ink paintings and scholar objects together. You have Japanese Nihonga painters, Korean artists. This is a Korean artist using steel shavings on his canvas to harken back to tradition, but is using a very contemporary material. You have the artist Wesley Thompson, who people might know here from his show at CCC. A phenomenal painter. Again, technique is really unusual, but also a finger painter. Lots of fun. There's a lot going on. That's the point. There's a lot going on in ink art, and it's really hard to define or categorize or, be very succinct about it. Also Masterpiece. This is a European fair coming to Hong Kong, also presenting ink art alongside European objects. So you have San Francis, but also Boching. So it's really nice to see this equation of Western artists with ink artists. Bridget Riley. Anyway, and so much to be discussed. So I'm getting the signal that I should stop. This is my last slide because I just didn't know how to stop talking about ink art. Something so interesting to me. But I just wanted to share this quote by Li Huayi because I just liked the analogy of ink to theater and performance. I think that ink is not a static movement. It's often likened, when artists talk about it, likened to music or dancing or cooking and performance. And I think that this is just what's so wonderful about the ink discourse, is that there's just so many ways to address it and think about it. So, thank you.